The silence of the streets. The old bus rattled down the narrow, uneven streets as it slowly trudged its way through the quieter side of town. The hum of its engine, the creaking of its wheels, and the rhythmic thump of the tires meeting potholes were like a gentle lullaby to the few passengers aboard. It had a familiar, comforting sound to it, almost like the steady pulse of life in a city that never truly slept but seemed to dream in fragments. The city was a mosaic of bustling activity in its heart, but out here in the forgotten corners, things moved at their own pace. Rocky knew this rhythm well. He had lived in this neighborhood for more years than he cared to count. The streets, though changing with time, still held a certain kind of peace. He'd seen them transform over the decades, once full of families and vibrant shops, now quieter, with more boarded-up windows and fewer smiles on the faces of those who passed by. But for Rocky, it was home. And today, the world outside his window seemed as distant as it always had been. Rocky, at 68 years old, had earned his share of silence. He'd spent his youth fighting for causes that felt too big to ever make sense of. He had lost friends in wars that weren't his own, had buried brothers in arms who would never walk this earth again. His body carried the weight of those years, his hands calloused from decades of hard work. He walked with the help of a cane now, a worn but steadfast companion, and his face, though marked by age and hardship, held an almost serene expression, an unreadable calm that those around him didn't always understand. His seat at the back of the bus was his sanctuary. He liked to sit here, looking out the window, his fingers lightly gripping the worn wood of his cane. There was something soothing about the familiar views, weathered houses with peeling paint, old storefronts that had seen better days, children laughing on street corners. The noise and chaos of the city seemed far away when he allowed his mind to wander like this. But the peace of his reverie wouldn't last long today. The sound of boots hitting the metal steps of the bus echoed through the quiet interior, drawing Rocky's attention without turning his head. The air around him seemed to thicken, a subtle shift in the energy of the space. He didn't need to look to know who had entered. He had seen this kind of thing before. A group of rowdy youths had climbed aboard. Their voices, loud and shrill, cut through the silence, infecting the calm atmosphere like a virus. Rocky heard the jarring scrape of the bus door closing behind them, followed by the shuffle of sneakers on the aisle floor. There was no mistaking the way they carried themselves, swaggering, their laughter boisterous and unrestrained. They were young, reckless, and too comfortable in their own skin, as though the world owed them something. The boys, there were 5 of them, made their way down the aisle, casting glances at the other passengers. Their eyes scanned the interior of the bus, the dim lighting, the faded seats, and the occasional commuter who was lost in their own world, too absorbed in their phones or books to notice the intrusion. But when their gaze fell upon Rocky, it was different. They zeroed in on him, like sharks circling prey. "Hey, old man." The leader of the group, a boy in his late teens, with wild, unkempt hair and a sneer on his face, called out across the bus. His voice carried with an arrogance that filled the space. "Get up. This seat ain't for dirty black folks like you. You're messing up the seat." Rocky didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, calm. He didn't even shift his position in the seat. This wasn't new to him. He had dealt with far worse in his life. He'd faced things that no one should have to face, and this petty insult, barely even registered. The boy's words, though laced with venom, bounced off him like raindrops on a stone. But the youth wasn't done. With a snarl, he took a few steps toward Rocky, his boots scraping against the floor with each step. "Did you hear me, old man?" he taunted. "Get up, or I'll make you. You don't belong here. This is our seat, not yours." The others in the group snickered, egging their leader on. Rocky, unmoved, continued to look out the window. The view outside hadn't changed, just the same dull scenery of crumbling buildings and broken sidewalks, but the group of youths had already decided he was an easy target. There was an arrogance in their eyes, the kind that came from never having had to struggle, never having to face the kind of hardships that some people endure just to survive. Rocky's knuckles tightened around his cane. It wasn't anger that gripped him, it was a quiet resignation. He knew the world was filled with ignorance. He had fought against it his whole life, in many different ways. It didn't surprise him that these boys, perhaps raised in their own insulated worlds, didn't know any better. They had no idea who they were messing with. But that didn't matter now. The leader reached out, his hand grabbing Rocky's shoulder, squeezing it with force. "You deaf, old man?" "I said get up," he spat, his breath hot on Rocky's neck. At that moment, something inside Rocky shifted. It wasn't anger, but rather the sudden, undeniable instinct of a soldier who had been trained to act in moments of crisis. Without a word, he shifted his weight and with a speed that belied his years, he spun around. In one fluid motion, Rocky's hand shot up and gripped the boy's wrist, stopping the shove in midair. There was a shock in the youth's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. His body was frozen, caught in the unexpected strength of an old man who moved like a man half his age. The gang of boys stepped back, unsure, eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you deaf, son?" Rocky's voice was low, calm, but it carried with it the weight of someone who had seen the worst of the world and wasn't intimidated by a foolish youth. He didn't need to raise his voice to command authority. His presence alone was enough. "You don't know who you're messing with." Before the boy could respond, Rocky had already moved. With the agility of someone who had fought many battles before, he let go of the boy's wrist and twisted his arm, sending him stumbling back. The boy collided with his friends, and before they could react, Rocky had struck again. In seconds, the gang of 5 was disoriented. One by one, they fell to the floor with grunts of surprise, their bravado crumbling like brittle paper in the face of a seasoned fighter. Each strike was precise, calculated. It wasn't brute force that Rocky used, it was skill, honed over years of fighting in jungles, fighting in wars, fighting just to survive. Every movement was deliberate, every motion aimed at disabling, not hurting. The youths, now sprawled out on the floor of the bus, groaned in confusion and embarrassment. They were not used to being on the receiving end of such an encounter. Their leader, barely able to lift his head from the floor, looked up at Rocky with wide, fearful eyes. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. Rocky stood over them, his cane tapping lightly on the floor as he straightened up. There was a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips, a quiet satisfaction that only came from knowing that you had proven something far beyond what they had expected. He looked at the boy who had dared to challenge him, his eyes sharp and knowing. "When I was fighting in Vietnam," he said, his voice carrying the weight of history, "I doubt your parents were even born. You've got no idea what it means to fight for your life." The bus was still. The air was thick with tension. The other passengers, once indifferent, now looked at Rocky with a mixture of awe and respect. The silence that had followed was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of the defeated youths. And in that moment, Rocky knew that life, no matter how quiet it had seemed, had a way of reminding you who you were, no matter how much time had passed. The unexpected encounter. The bus continued its sluggish journey through the streets, the quiet hum of its old engine the only sound breaking the stillness left in the wake of the brief confrontation. The youths, now gathered at the back, sat in stunned silence, nursing their bruised egos more than their physical pain. They hadn't expected an old man, no, an elderly black man, to move so quickly, so decisively. The speed, the precision of his movements, had caught them completely off guard. It wasn't just their pride that was wounded, it was their very sense of invincibility. In their eyes, people like Rocky weren't supposed to be able to do what he had done. They muttered among themselves in low, defeated tones, avoiding any eye contact with the passengers around them. Every now and then, one of them would glance sideways at Rocky, as though they expected him to lash out again. But Rocky was still, his body calm, his expression unreadable. He hadn't even broken a sweat. The bus was moving slower now, as if the whole thing had caught its breath. A few stops passed without incident, the usual chatter of passengers replaced by a quiet hum. It was as though the world had paused to acknowledge the strange power that had just been released into the air. The other passengers, who had been so indifferent to Rocky's presence just moments before, now regarded him differently. It wasn't just because he had defended himself with such skill, it was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were, regardless of your age, race, or status. And then, as the bus rumbled on, a shift in the atmosphere. A man, well-dressed in a dark suit, rose from his seat near the front. He was in his mid-40s, tall, and carried himself with an air of self-assurance that was hard to ignore. He moved with purpose, the confidence in his stride impossible to miss. His sharp features, neatly combed hair, and polished shoes were in stark contrast to the worn, faded world around him, but it wasn't his appearance that drew attention, it was his presence. He stepped carefully down the aisle, eyes fixed on Rocky, who remained seated at the back, as though the incident had never occurred. For a moment, it seemed as though the man was going to pass by, as if he had nothing to say. But then he stopped, standing beside Rocky, looking down at him with something akin to respect. "You're a Vietnam veteran, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice smooth and calm, with just the right amount of authority. Rocky didn't immediately respond. He was still looking out the window, his gaze distant, as though he hadn't heard the question at all. The bus rumbled on, its noise blending with the rustling of papers from other passengers, the occasional cough, and the soft murmur of the youths, still trying to recover from their encounter. The man, undeterred, continued speaking. "I could tell by the way you moved. The discipline, the calmness in your eyes. You've seen things. Been through things that most people can't even imagine." There was a pause as he studied Rocky, his face unreadable. "You're not like anyone else on this bus. Not like those kids, not like any of us." Rocky finally turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the man's for the first time. They were calm, steady, but there was something deeper in them, a hint of wariness, as if he were assessing this new presence in his life. "You don't know me," Rocky said softly, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that seemed to make the air around them grow thicker. The man nodded, acknowledging the truth in Rocky's words. "No. But I know a man who has been through the kind of hardship you've endured doesn't go unnoticed. Not by people who understand what it means to truly survive." Rocky narrowed his eyes slightly, his grip tightening on his cane, not out of anger, but of curiosity. He wasn't one to easily open up to strangers, let alone trust them, but there was something about this man, Kyler, as he had introduced himself, that seemed different. Kyler smiled, sensing the hesitation. "Let me explain," he continued, his voice low and persuasive. "I run a company that specializes in training soldiers, bodyguards, and security personnel. People who understand real danger, not just the kind of training they teach in a classroom. We need someone who's been in the trenches, someone who knows what it's like to face death and come out alive. Someone who doesn't get rattled when things go south. That's where you come in." Rocky's eyes remained fixed on Kyler, but there was a flicker of something in them, something that could almost be mistaken for interest. "I'm old, son. I don't need to be training people for anything. What would I be teaching them?" His voice was low, almost gruff, as if he were dismissing the idea before it even fully formed. Kyler shook his head, unfazed. "I'm not talking about just teaching fighting. I'm talking about experience, real-life experience. We need someone who can mentor these recruits, who can show them that there's more to surviving a war, more to surviving life, than just muscle and firepower. They need someone to teach them the mental game, how to stay calm when everything around them is falling apart. And I see that in you." The bus rumbled along, and for a long moment, Rocky said nothing. His eyes flicked to the side for just a moment, catching the reflection of his weathered face in the dirty glass of the window. He didn't look like the same man he had been in his youth, the man who had marched into battle with a rifle in hand, the man who had seen his brothers fall in the muck and blood of war. That man was gone. In his place was this older version, someone who had put those memories behind him and had learned to live with the quiet aftershock of war. But the offer Kyler was presenting was different. It wasn't just a chance to relive the past, it was an opportunity to pass on what he had learned. "I'm not interested in reliving the past," Rocky said quietly, his voice laced with the weight of those years. "The past is where it belongs." Kyler nodded again, understanding. "I get that. It's not about going back. It's about using the knowledge you've gained to help the next generation, to show them how to live through the fire. We're not asking you to fight another war. We're asking you to pass on the legacy of survival, of wisdom, of experience that can't be taught in any textbook." The words hung in the air, settling over Rocky like a heavy fog. The offer was tempting, but it was also complicated. Rocky had lived his life under the radar, never seeking the limelight, never wanting to draw attention to himself. But in his quiet, humble way, he knew he had lived a life others could learn from. The question was he ready to teach? As the bus rolled past the familiar landmarks of his neighborhood, places that had changed, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better, Rocky's mind wandered. He had seen it all. The young men he had fought with in Vietnam had been eager, full of hope and dreams, only to be shattered by the brutality of war. Some came home to nothing, others never came home at all. And now, all these years later, here he was, being asked to pass on that painful legacy. Kyler's voice broke through his thoughts once again. "Think about it, Rocky. You have a chance to make a difference in ways you haven't even considered. You don't have to be a soldier anymore. But you can still fight for something, them. The future." Rocky turned to face Kyler fully, his face inscrutable. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice steady. "But don't get your hopes up too high." Kyler smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "I won't. But I think you'll come around." As the bus pulled into the next stop, the door creaked open, and passengers began to shuffle off, heading into the day. But for Rocky, something had changed. The world outside still seemed as distant as ever, but now, there was a new thought in his mind, a question that would follow him through the rest of his quiet, solitary day. Could he still be of use? Could the old soldier find a new purpose, even now? The decision. The morning after his encounter with Kyler, the first rays of sunlight crept through the cracks in the heavy curtains of Rocky's small apartment. The room was a modest one, filled with the faint scent of old wood and the memories of a life well lived. Rocky sat at a small table in the corner, his worn coffee mug cradled in his hands. The apartment was sparse, just the essentials. A faded armchair by the window, a bookshelf with books mostly untouched for years, and a desk cluttered with papers that he rarely bothered to sort. To anyone who stepped inside, it was clear that Rocky valued simplicity over excess. Life had taught him that much. His eyes, tired but sharp, traced the delicate steam rising from his mug. The liquid within had long since cooled, but the motion of holding it offered him comfort. There was a lingering silence in the room, a heavy stillness that mirrored the thoughts swirling in his mind. The day had only just begun, but the decision weighing on him had already rooted itself in his consciousness. Rocky thought back to the bus ride, the confrontation with the youths and the man who had approached him afterward. Kyler's words echoed in his head, the offer lingering like an unspoken invitation. You don't have to fight another war, you can still fight for something, them. The future. His grip tightened on the mug as the memory of those words replayed. He had seen more than his fair share of battles in his time. The wars, Vietnam, the skirmishes, the fights that seemed to have no end, were all behind him now. There were scars he carried, invisible ones that hadn't healed, and the idea of stepping back into that world, even as a mentor, felt both foreign and enticing. But was it something he wanted? Was it a world he was willing to return to? He had spent years avoiding the battlefield, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned that fighting had a way of consuming you. You either kept fighting until there was nothing left of you, or you walked away, something few had the strength to do. Rocky had walked away. But now, here was a man who was asking him to come back. Not to fight, not to wage war, but to pass on his knowledge, to teach others how to survive, how to endure, how to face what life threw at them. There was something undeniably appealing about the idea. He could sense it, the faint tug in his chest. A chance to shape something again, to guide someone who needed direction, someone who needed to understand what it meant to really survive. But there were obstacles. Rocky knew the reality of the situation. It wasn't just about teaching, it wasn't just about being a mentor. It was about what he would have to leave behind. Could he still carry the weight of those memories without being consumed by them again? Could he return to a world of violence without losing the peace he had fought so hard to maintain? The phone on the small desk beside him buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He had forgotten he had left it on. He set the mug down and walked over to the desk, his joints creaking as he moved. His fingers, stiff from age and the years of labor, fumbled slightly as he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice was low, almost gruff, a habitual tone developed over years of not needing to say much. "Rocky?" "It's Kyler," came the smooth voice from the other end of the line. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, it's fine," Rocky replied, his voice soft but steady. He settled into the old chair at the desk and glanced out the window, watching the morning light dance on the cracked pavement below. "I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday," Kyler continued. "I wanted to give you more time, but I'm sure you've got your doubts. I don't want to pressure you into anything, but I'll be straight with you. We need someone like you. Someone with the kind of experience that can't be taught in a classroom. The world is changing, Rocky. These young people, they don't know what it's really like to fight for their lives. They think they do, but they don't. I know you've been through more than any of them can imagine." Rocky's eyes narrowed, and he exhaled a long breath. He had known this was coming. Kyler wasn't the type of man to let things go easily. But there was sincerity in his voice, something more than just a business pitch. Kyler was offering him something more than a job. He was offering a purpose. And that was the part Rocky couldn't shake. "I don't know," Rocky said finally, the words heavy on his tongue. "I'm not the man I used to be, Kyler. I've seen too much. I've been through too much. It's not easy to go back to that kind of life. Teaching others? Sure. But there's more to it than just passing on knowledge. I'm not sure I'm ready to open that door again." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Kyler's voice softened, almost as if he understood. "I get it, Rocky. I do. You've earned your peace. But peace doesn't mean standing still. It doesn't mean letting the world pass you by. Sometimes, the fight you've walked away from is the very one that needs you to come back. I'm not asking you to go to war again. But I am asking you to help these people. To help them survive in a world that doesn't understand what it means to fight, to endure." Rocky's hand tightened around the phone as his thoughts swirled. Kyler was right, in a way. The world wasn't the same as it had been when he was in Vietnam. There was no war now, no immediate threat, but there was still a war being fought, one of a different nature. A war within, a war for purpose, for meaning. The young men and women of today, the ones Kyler spoke of, didn't face bullets and bombs, but they faced something just as dangerous: apathy, fear, and ignorance. They were struggling in their own ways, just as Rocky had once struggled, and maybe, just maybe, he could help them find their way. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," Rocky muttered more to himself than to Kyler. "I'm old. What good am I in a world like this? Kyler's voice cut through the hesitation, steady and firm. "You're more than you think, Rocky. You're exactly what they need. And you're the only one who can teach them. There's no one else who can offer what you can. What you've learned. And this isn't just about them. It's about you too. You still have a chance to make an impact. To do something important. Don't let that slip away." Silence followed Kyler's words, the weight of his offer hanging between them like a challenge. Rocky could feel the pull of it, the lure of purpose. "All right," Rocky said finally, the words rolling out slowly, with a mix of reluctance and something else, something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "All right, I'll do it. But I'm not doing it for you. And I'm not doing it for anyone else. I'm doing it because I've lived long enough to know that sometimes, you've got to pass something on before you can truly walk away." There was a long pause on the other end, and then Kyler let out a relieved breath. "Thank you, Rocky. I knew you'd come around." Rocky hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, his mind racing. His heart beat a little faster now, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something that he had forgotten, a sense of purpose, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He stood up from the desk, his bones aching slightly from the effort. His hands, the same hands that had once carried a rifle through the jungles of Vietnam, now rested on the edge of his desk as he looked out the window. The world was still out there. The sun was rising, and the city, his city, was alive with possibilities. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to walk it. "I'm coming back," he whispered softly to himself. The decision had been made. A new chapter. The next few days passed by in a blur for Rocky. He moved through his routine, though there was a new weight in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation. The world outside his window remained as unchanged as ever, but within him, something had shifted. The decision he had made wasn't easy, it wasn't something he took lightly. But there was no turning back now. Kyler had been persistent, his offer genuine, and despite all his doubts, Rocky had accepted. He was going to do this. He was going to help, to teach, to pass on what he had learned over a lifetime of hardship and survival. It was strange, though. Rocky had never thought of himself as a teacher. He had never sought out a life where he would be leading others. His path had always been one of survival. He fought battles for himself and his brothers in arms. But now, here he was, at a crossroads he never imagined. Could he really teach the younger generation what it meant to survive, to endure? Would they even listen? Kyler had assured him that there was a place for him, an opportunity to train recruits at a facility not far from the city. It wasn't a military base, it was a private company specializing in high-level training for security and defense professionals. It sounded like a world apart from the jungles of Vietnam, but in many ways, it was the same. The stakes were different, but the need for real, lived experience, the need for mental toughness, was just as critical. The day Rocky arrived at the training facility, it was early morning. The sky was overcast, a low gray cloud hanging over the horizon. The air was thick with humidity, and Rocky could feel the familiar ache in his joints as he stepped out of his old sedan. He had kept his life simple, preferring not to stand out. He wasn't someone who needed a flashy car or a suit. But today, he needed to be more than just the quiet old man. Today, he had to step into a role he had never imagined. The building was large, modern, but not overwhelmingly so. It looked like a place where serious work was done, steel fencing surrounded the complex, and there were no signs of excess. The training grounds were expansive, with dirt tracks, obstacle courses, and several areas set aside for more specialized exercises. In the distance, he could see a few figures in tactical gear, running drills. The whole place felt alive with purpose. As he entered the front lobby, a young receptionist greeted him with a smile, though there was a certain formality to her demeanor. "Welcome, Mr. Rocky," she said, her voice polite but professional. "Mr. Kyler is expecting you. Please, follow me." Rocky nodded and followed her down a long hallway. The building hummed with the energy of people preparing for something important. He passed through various doors, each one leading to rooms filled with equipment and training materials, guns, gear, maps, and charts. This wasn't the war he had known, but the intensity of it was still palpable. This place smelled like strategy, like preparedness. It felt like a place where things happened, things that could make or break lives. They reached a large conference room at the end of the hallway, and the receptionist knocked once before opening the door. Inside, Kyler was waiting for him, dressed in his usual sharp attire. His face lit up when he saw Rocky, and he stood up from the polished wooden table to greet him. "Rocky, good to see you," Kyler said, his voice full of warmth. "I'm glad you decided to come by. We've got a lot of work to do, but I'm confident you'll fit right in." Rocky nodded, but his eyes were sharp, assessing everything in the room. There was a sense of calm about him, though anyone who knew to look could see the internal battle he was fighting. This wasn't his world. But it was the world now, and he had a place in it. At least, that's what Kyler had promised. "I'm ready," Rocky said simply, his voice calm and steady. Kyler smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something like recognition. "I know you are. That's why we're here today. Let me show you the recruits." Kyler led Rocky down to the training grounds, where a group of young men and women were gathered, all wearing tactical uniforms, stretching and preparing for their morning drills. They looked serious, focused, but there was an air of naivety about them. Rocky could see it immediately. They had been taught to look tough, but they didn't have the grit that came from real experience. They didn't have the weight of battle in their eyes, the way he had learned to see it. Kyler gestured toward the group. "These are the new recruits. Most of them are fresh out of training academies, ready to get into the field. They've got the basics down, but they need something more. Something real." Rocky's gaze swept over them. They were younger than he'd imagined. Their faces were eager, hopeful, more so than he had expected. He saw the usual mix of cocky grins and nervous energy. They were here because they wanted to prove something. Maybe they wanted to be soldiers, or security personnel, or maybe they just wanted the paycheck. Either way, they didn't know what it truly meant to fight for your life, to lose everything and still keep going. One of the recruits, a tall man with sharp features and a too-casual stance, noticed them standing at the edge of the field and sauntered over with a grin on his face. "You the old man they brought in to teach us a thing or two?" he asked, his voice thick with arrogance. Rocky looked at him, sizing him up in silence. He didn't react, didn't rise to the challenge. Instead, he simply studied the young man. His posture was too relaxed, his body language too open. He wasn't prepared for a fight, for anything. And Rocky could see it in his eyes. The recruit raised an eyebrow, expecting a response, but Rocky just shook his head. "You're not ready," he said quietly, his voice steady. The young man blinked, clearly taken aback. He expected the old man to either ignore him or engage in some kind of banter, but Rocky wasn't interested in that. He wasn't here to waste time. Kyler stepped in, clearly sensing the tension. All right, enough of the introductions," he said, giving the recruit a pointed look before turning back to Rocky. "We're starting the first drill. I want you to show them what you can do." Rocky's eyes met Kyler's. He didn't need to be told twice. It was clear what was expected of him. He stepped forward, tapping his cane lightly on the ground as he moved. As he reached the center of the field, he stopped and turned back to face the recruits. "All right," Rocky said, his voice clear and firm. "You think you're ready to fight? You think you can survive out there? Show me." The recruits exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. But they all stood straighter, eager to prove themselves. This was a test, and they had no intention of failing. The young recruit who had spoken earlier stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "I'll show you how it's done, old man." Rocky didn't move as the young man charged at him, overconfident, too eager. The first mistake of many. The moment the recruit was within arm's reach, Rocky sidestepped, his cane snapping upward in a swift, precise motion. With one well-timed strike, he knocked the young man off balance, sending him sprawling onto the dirt. The other recruits gasped in surprise. Rocky didn't wait for him to recover. As the recruit scrambled to his feet, Rocky was already there, his movements faster than anyone had anticipated. He grabbed the recruit's arm, twisting it with expert precision before guiding him gently to the ground. He wasn't trying to hurt the young man, he was teaching him. "Stay focused," Rocky said, his voice low and authoritative. "You can't rush in blindly. You need to read your opponent, feel their rhythm, their intentions." The recruits stood in stunned silence, watching the old man with new eyes. This wasn't some theatrical fight, some choreographed performance. Rocky's movements were fluid, instinctive, and controlled. This was real. "Anyone else want to try?" Rocky asked, his voice unwavering. A few recruits hesitated, exchanging uneasy looks. The young man who had challenged him earlier picked himself up, dusted himself off, and met Rocky's gaze, his arrogance now tempered by respect. Rocky nodded slightly. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, moving to the center of the field. And just like that, the lesson began. The test of endurance. As the days turned into weeks, Rocky found himself adapting to this new chapter in his life more quickly than he had anticipated. Despite his initial reservations, the training center had started to feel like a second home. It wasn't the same as the war-torn jungles of Vietnam, but it was still a place where survival was paramount. Rocky wasn't just a teacher here, he was a guide, a mentor, helping these young recruits prepare for a world that demanded toughness, resilience, and mental fortitude. The training was grueling, far beyond what any of the recruits had experienced in their previous academies. Every day was a test of endurance, physically, emotionally, and mentally. They ran drills in sweltering heat, carried heavy loads through obstacle courses designed to break their spirits, and practiced hand-to-hand combat until their bodies ached. But the physical trials were nothing compared to the lessons Rocky taught them outside of the exercises. In the early days, he had them run laps, sometimes for hours, until their legs were burning, their breath ragged, and their willpower shattered. When they asked why, Rocky simply told them, "When you feel like you can't go on, that's when you need to find out what's left inside you. You've got more in you than you think." Some of them struggled. The younger recruits, especially, were still trying to break free of their egos. The same recruit who had initially challenged Rocky, David, a tall, athletic man, was the worst of them. He had come into the program with a chip on his shoulder, convinced that his physical prowess would carry him through. He was fast, strong, and confident, but that only took him so far. When the drills became more intense, he began to falter. His stamina wasn't enough to keep up, and soon, he was trailing behind the others, his frustration growing by the day. Rocky watched him carefully. It was clear that David needed more than just physical training, he needed discipline, the kind that didn't come from sheer power but from mental strength. So Rocky began to focus on him more closely. During one of the more difficult exercises, an overnight survival drill that required the recruits to navigate a dense wooded area while remaining undetected, Rocky paired David with another recruit, a young woman named Elena. Elena was quieter, smaller than David, but she had a certain calmness to her, a level-headedness that made her strong in situations where most would crumble. The drill was simple on the surface: make it through the woods undetected. But there was more to it. They were expected to find shelter, gather food, and keep moving without leaving a trace. It was a test of both tactical skill and perseverance. David grumbled as he set out alongside Elena. Why do I have to be with her? She's not even built for this. Elena, unperturbed, didn't respond. She knew that it was pointless to argue. They moved through the woods at a steady pace, Elena leading the way, her steps light and calculated. David lagged behind, his mind filled with frustration. He was used to being the best, and this exercise, this unexpected pairing, felt like a slap in the face. As the night wore on, the conditions became more difficult. The air was thick with humidity, and the mosquitoes were relentless. David's frustration grew, but he held his tongue. They had to find shelter soon, or they wouldn't make it through the night. Finally, after several hours, Elena found a small clearing and began to gather materials for a shelter. David, unable to sit still, started pacing around the perimeter. His impatience was palpable, and it was starting to affect his judgment. Just follow my lead, Elena said, without looking up. Focus. Stay calm. We can't afford to make mistakes. David snapped back, I don't need you to tell me what to do. I've done this before. I've been in the field. I know how to survive. Elena didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. She was right, David had done this before, but it had been different. He had never faced the kind of isolation that came with real survival. He had never been out there without the security of a team or the structure of a mission. And it was that reality that would break or make him. As they worked, the night grew colder, and the tension between them was palpable. They finished their shelter, but it wasn't enough to protect them from the elements. They were still exposed, and as the hours passed, the chill set in. David, despite his strength, was clearly uncomfortable. His body was trembling slightly, his pride stinging every time he had to ask Elena for help. At one point, he snapped. This is pointless. I'm freezing my ass off. What kind of training is this? We're supposed to be ready for real threats, not playing survivalist games. Elena turned to him slowly, her face calm. You're not freezing because of the cold. You're freezing because you're letting it get to you. Your mind is weak, David. That's what's breaking you. David's face flushed, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to lash out. But then, he caught himself. Something about Elena's words struck deep inside him. He had always prided himself on his physical strength, but here, in the heart of the wilderness, it was his mental resolve that was lacking. Through the rest of the night, David said little, but his mind was working overtime. He watched Elena as she made adjustments to their shelter, her focus unwavering. Despite the conditions, despite the discomfort, she kept moving, kept thinking. She didn't give in. And that's when it clicked for David. Survival wasn't about how fast you could run or how hard you could punch. It was about resilience, about keeping your mind steady when everything else seemed to fall apart. By morning, they had made it through the night. David wasn't proud of how he had started, but he was relieved that he had finished. He realized that Elena had taught him more than he could have imagined. She wasn't just showing him how to survive in the wilderness, she was showing him how to survive in life. As they returned to the training camp, David was quieter than usual. His steps were more measured, and his posture had shifted. The arrogance had started to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. When they returned to the main group, he sought out Rocky, who had been overseeing the training from a distance. I get it now, David said, his voice uncharacteristically humble. It's not just about being strong. It's about not giving up. Even when everything around you is falling apart. Rocky nodded, his gaze unwavering. Exactly. The body will always get tired. But the mind, that's where the real battle is fought. If you lose it, you lose everything. David stood for a moment, absorbing the lesson. Then, without saying anything else, he walked off to join the rest of the recruits. He knew that the real test was only beginning. Rocky watched him go, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The boy had learned something valuable, something that couldn't be taught in a classroom or through textbooks. And though it had taken a harsh lesson, it was a step in the right direction. The next few weeks brought more challenges, more tests, and more lessons. As Rocky continued to push the recruits to their limits, he could see the changes in them. Some were learning quickly, others were struggling, but all were growing. They were becoming stronger, more resilient. And slowly, Rocky began to realize something that he hadn't fully understood at first. He wasn't just here to pass on the lessons of survival. He was here to teach these recruits something deeper, something that went beyond tactics and skills. He was teaching them how to face life with dignity, with strength, and with the unshakable belief that no matter how hard things got, they could survive. By the time the final exam was upon them, an endurance test that would push each recruit to the brink of exhaustion, Rocky had come to understand that he had found a new purpose. This was more than just a job, more than just passing on skills. This was his way of fighting back, not with a weapon, but with wisdom. It was his way of honoring the brothers he had lost, the lessons he had learned, and the quiet strength that had kept him alive all these years. When the day of the final test arrived, Rocky stood in the background, watching the recruits as they prepared to face their ultimate challenge. As they lined up, their faces filled with determination and fear, he knew that whatever happened next, they had all come a long way. And in the end, that was all that mattered. "You ready?" Kyler asked, coming to stand beside him. Rocky looked at the recruits. At the men and women who had struggled and fought and persevered, and nodded. "They're ready." And with that, the test began, the final test. The day had arrived. The recruits, now seasoned in the ways of survival, lined up before Rocky and Kyler at the edge of the training field. The sun was high in the sky, its heat sweltering, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was thick with anticipation, and the tension was palpable. Every single recruit stood straight, their faces serious, eyes focused ahead. For most of them, this final test would determine if they were truly ready for what the world could throw at them. Kyler stood beside Rocky, his arms folded, an air of satisfaction on his face. "This is it," he said, his voice low but full of pride. "They've come a long way. But this? This is where they'll prove if they can really handle the pressure." Rocky nodded, but his eyes remained on the recruits. They had all grown. Some had matured into formidable soldiers, others were still figuring out their place, but every single one of them had something to prove today, not just to Kyler, not just to the system, but to themselves. Rocky knew that the real test wasn't the drills or the physical endurance, it was what lay beneath. It was about grit. It was about staying composed when your body and mind screamed for you to stop. And it was about what came after failure, whether you could rise again. The final test would push them to their limits, physically, mentally, and emotionally. It was a combination of everything they had learned over the past few months. They would run a series of grueling challenges designed to simulate real-world situations. Their speed, their ability to stay calm under fire, and their survival instincts would all be tested. Rocky would be observing from the sidelines, but the real test would be their ability to act independently, to lead, and to think in high-pressure situations. David, the young recruit who had come so far from his cocky beginnings, stood near the front. His expression was calm, his eyes focused. He had learned from his mistakes in the past. He knew now that it wasn't the physical strength that mattered the most. It was the ability to endure the things that came from within. The mental fortitude. He felt prepared, more prepared than he ever had before. The rest of the recruits, Elena, the quiet but strong-willed young woman, a few others who had been training alongside him, were also standing tall. They were ready, or so they thought. Kyler moved to the front and addressed the group, his voice carrying across the training field. "All right, listen up. This is the culmination of everything you've been through. You will face multiple challenges, physical, mental, tactical. Some of you will fall short. Some of you will rise above the rest. It's not about being perfect, it's about finishing strong. Do your best, and remember everything Rocky and I have taught you. Rocky stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wasn't here to give a motivational speech, though. That wasn't his style. Instead, he simply spoke with the quiet authority that came from experience. You've been through the ringer, Rocky said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the recruits. But today is different. Today, you'll see how well you know yourselves. Because that's what it comes down to. Your body may fail you, your mind may play tricks on you, but you have to know when to push forward. You have to know when to fight, and when to stop and think. There was a long pause as the recruits absorbed his words. Rocky's gaze swept across them, each face, each individual story, each person carrying their own burden. He could see the doubt in some of their eyes, the fear of the unknown in others. But there was also something else, something that made him proud. They had come this far. They had earned the right to be here. Kyler motioned for them to begin, and the recruits scattered to their designated stations. The first challenge was simple enough in concept, a sprint through a grueling obstacle course filled with mud, climbing walls, and hurdles. But in reality, it was far from easy. The recruits had to navigate it with speed, but also with precision. One wrong move, and the clock would tick against them. David was among the first to start, his legs moving like pistons, his breath steady. He had trained for this, and he pushed himself to the limit, barely pausing as he cleared one obstacle after another. The others followed, each of them struggling in their own ways, but all trying to keep pace with the intensity of the test. David reached the final wall, a vertical climb that required every ounce of strength and technique he had. His fingers, slick with sweat, gripped the rough surface, and his muscles screamed for relief. His heart pounded, but he pushed through. He was almost there. Just one more move, one more stretch, and he would be on top. But as he reached the summit, his foot slipped. The sudden jolt sent him falling back down, and for a split second, everything in his mind went blank. He hit the ground hard, his chest heaving with the force of the fall. He lay there, staring up at the sky for a moment, the world spinning around him. He felt the sting of failure wash over him. For a moment, all he could think about was how badly he had messed up. How close he was to finishing, only to lose it all in one instant. But then he heard a voice. "Get up, David," came Rocky's calm, unflinching voice from the sidelines. "You're not done until you get back up." David blinked, the words sinking in. He had fallen, but that wasn't the end. Not yet. With grit and determination, he slowly pulled himself up, dusted off his uniform, and began again. The second time, he scaled the wall without hesitation. His mind was clear now, focused only on the task at hand. He had learned something in that fall, something invaluable. It wasn't about avoiding failure, it was about how you responded when it came. As David finished the course, he saw the others still struggling with their own parts of the challenge. Some were finishing strong, others had faltered at different points along the way. The clock was ticking, but there was no time to waste on regrets. The next challenge was a mental one, a series of tactical decision-making scenarios. The recruits were separated into groups, and they had to solve complex situations with limited resources and under time pressure. These weren't just puzzles, they were designed to test their instincts, their leadership, and their ability to think on their feet. David's group was tasked with a hostage situation simulation. They had to infiltrate a building, neutralize threats, and safely extract the hostages, all while making sure no innocent lives were harmed. David took a deep breath as the scenario began. His team moved quickly, but it wasn't without mistakes. They missed certain angles, miscommunicated on a few critical decisions. The tension in the air was suffocating, and David could feel the pressure mounting. But despite the mistakes, David led his team with a newfound focus. He remembered Rocky's words about not giving up, about staying calm under fire. He didn't have the answers to every question, but he was thinking more clearly now. He wasn't just reacting, he was leading with intent. They completed the mission, and though they hadn't been perfect, they succeeded in the end. As the test continued through its various phases, endurance, tactical exercises, and team-building challenges, David and the others learned what it meant to truly be tested. It wasn't about individual glory or success. It was about working together, pushing each other, and learning how to deal with the obstacles life threw at them. When the final bell rang and the test was over, all of the recruits stood in front of Rocky and Kyler, exhausted but proud. There was no sense of triumph in the air, no celebrating. Instead, there was an unspoken recognition among them, a sense of camaraderie, of shared experience. They had all been tested, all had struggled, and each had overcome their own challenges. Kyler stepped forward, clapping his hands together. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've earned your place. All of you. But remember, this is just the beginning." David, standing at the front of the group, looked around at the others, his teammates, his fellow survivors, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything. He had learned the most important lesson of all: survival wasn't just about strength. It was about resilience. About rising when you fall. About never, ever giving up. Rocky, watching from the sidelines, nodded to himself. They were ready. And just like that, a new chapter had begun for them all.